Lincoln uses the Gettysburg Address to make a call to action. What is his call to action? What methods does Lincoln use to craft his call to action? Use evidence from the text to support your conclusion. In this lesson, you will learn how to determine how an author advances his purpose by analyzing the author's rhetoric. We've been reading Abraham Lincoln's speech, the Gettysburg Address. This is a non-fiction persuasive speech that Lincoln gave on November 19, 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg. Let's also review rhetoric. Rhetoric refers to the author's technique to advance his or her purpose. Common techniques relate to appeals to knowledge and reason, emotion, as well as ideals and credibility. To accomplish our task, we are going to use the following 3 steps. Reread the text underlying examples of rhetoric. Ask, how do these examples make the audience feel? Infer, what is the author's purpose for doing this? Lincoln uses the Gettysburg Address to make a call to action. What is the call to action? What methods does Lincoln use to craft his call to action? Use evidence from the text to support your conclusion. I am beginning by rereading the text and underlying examples of rhetoric. I am looking for words and phrases that will appeal to the audience. The speech begins, 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Wow! His word choice for the entire paragraph is very engaging and poetic. For example, he chose our fathers, as well as conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, to introduce the idea that people made the country with the ideals of liberty and equality. In the second and third paragraph, he also mentions the ideals and talks about protecting and restoring them. Here are some examples from paragraph 2. In this paragraph, he uses powerful language and metaphor. In lesson 4, we talked about Lincoln's use of metaphor and the image it creates. Lincoln uses that imagery of a battlefield to illustrate the conflict over the ideals. These are a couple of examples of the inclusive language Lincoln uses in his speech. In paragraph 1, he says, our fathers. In paragraph 3, he comments, it is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work. In the same paragraph, he also comments that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. This is inclusive and emotionally loaded. Since I identified some examples of rhetoric, the next step is to ask, how do these examples make the audience feel? Earlier, we reviewed that some techniques of rhetoric include appeals to knowledge and reasoning, emotion and ideals and credibility. To answer this question, I will go through each of these and think about the feelings they invoke. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is very engaging language. Lincoln could have used other words to say the same thing, but this is an attention grabber. He is also speaking of the American ideals of liberty and equality. This example makes the audience feel engaged and that being dedicated to those two ideals is what it takes to be American, so it also appeals to national identity. The next set, which uses the metaphor, really helps me to imagine a war with life and death at stake. This brings up feelings of fear or concern, because war can be scary, but also feelings of protectiveness. In this final set, Lincoln uses all the inclusive pronouns, including our fathers. It makes me feel like this is something that we are all together, even that we are a family. This also makes the audience feel responsible, especially this last comment, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. This last comment makes me feel like it is something we are all doing, and we better get it done, otherwise people's lives were lost for naught. That is some pressure. Now it is time to infer. What is the author's purpose for doing this? I have to think about why Lincoln chose those words and why he wanted the audience to feel engaged or concerned, like we're all a family and a sense of responsibility. As I was reading the Gettysburg Address, I could tell that the equality and liberty are two American ideals that are really important to Lincoln. He mentioned them throughout his speech. He chose words that were interesting so that they would engage the audience and keep them paying attention and make them feel like they need to value those ideals as well. He also chose words to make the audience feel concerned about the safety of the ideals and the protective of them too. He also made this feel like a family thing and that he and the audience have a responsibility. When I put everything together, I can see that he wanted these ideals to be so important to his audience that they feel the responsibility to unite and fight together to protect and restore them. Now we will revisit the original question. Lincoln uses the Gettysburg Address to make a call to action. What is the call to action? What methods does Lincoln use to craft his call to action? Use evidence from the text to support your conclusion. In order to answer this question, I will use the examples I gathered and my notes. Abraham Lincoln gave the speech on the battlefield of Gettysburg on November 19, 1863. While he honored the people who fought and died in the battle, his primary purpose was to persuade his audience to take action. He asked the audience to complete the unfinished work of protecting and restoring the American ideals of liberty and equality. In the introduction, Lincoln uses references to the founding of our nation to craft his call to action. He powerfully engages his audience by referring to a nation conceived in liberty with founders dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He revisits these ideals, insisting that these American ideals need to be protected and restored. He asks the audience to dedicate themselves to this unfinished work. In paragraph 2, Lincoln refers to a literal and metaphorical battlefield to compel his audience to action. He uses the imagery to relate to his audience and voice his concerns. He's concerned about the nation's ability to endure with these ideals. Lincoln uses the fact that they are met on a great battlefield as a concrete picture to emphasize the magnitude of the war. He stresses that they need to win the metaphorical fight to preserve the ideals of liberty and equality. Lincoln greatly influenced his audience through the use of words such as our fathers and conceived. The connotation of these words bringing a familial and emotional aspect to his speech. His use of inclusive pronouns such as we and our also connects him to the audience. He creates a sense of duty and purpose when he assigns the listeners with a goal to be dedicated here to the unfinished work so that those who fought shall not have died in vain. Lincoln unites the audience in his call to action and creates a sense of common responsibility to the nation. Lincoln's reference to the Founding Fathers, use of figurative language, and inclusivity through his speech compels the audience to act in protection of America's ideals. To accomplish our task, we have reread the text, underlining examples of the rhetoric, asked, how do these examples make the audience feel? And inferred, what is the author's purpose for doing this? In this lesson, you have learned how to determine how an author advances his purpose by analyzing the author's rhetoric.